Howdy y'all. Happy Pride Month, although I must say, it hasn't been a very happy month for some members of the community. In recent years, the right has been making it increasingly clear that their main target for hate, violence, and vitriol is transgender people. Across the country, states are enacting a plethora of anti-trans legislation, and proponents of anti-trans legislation claim these bills will make society better. Now, this is false, obviously. Screwing over trans people is bad, but even if you ignore the suffering of trans people, which is what the right wants you to do, these laws are still bad, because across the board, transphobia hurts cisgender people too. Now, before we get into how these laws hurt cis people, I want to clarify something so nobody has an excuse to yell at me in the comments about this. I am not downplaying the pain of trans people or saying that the sissies have it just as tough. I mean, if the rhetoric of some conservative politicians is anything to go off of, trans people could be facing an imminent genocide. Cis people, as a group, are not facing this. I merely want to examine how transphobes are willing to push legislation that makes life worse for them, just so they can make it even worse for trans people. First, let's take a look at bathroom bills. Bathroom bills have grown increasingly common in recent years as transphobic legislators attempt to force trans people to use the restrooms correlating with their assigned gender at birth. Their reasoning for these laws is a cited fear of trans people assaulting women in restrooms, and the idea that a man could claim to be trans in order to assault women in restrooms. These reasons hold no actual water though, because 1. Trans people are not assaulting people in restrooms, and 2. Cis men don't need to pretend to be trans to assault women. Furthermore, these laws actually increase sexual assault, because in addition to the emotional toll of being barred from using the proper restrooms, trans people who are forced to use the wrong bathroom are more likely to face harassment and assault. A 2019 study found that 36% of transgender teens in schools with restrictive bathroom policies reported having been sexually assaulted in the past year, compared to 26% of trans teens overall, which is also horrifying. Okay, so we know that the problem these bills are supposed to address doesn't exist, and that these bills result in trans people getting sexually assaulted. But hurting trans people is the goal, so proponents of these laws might be unswayed. Luckily for the TERF community, there's a selfish reason to oppose these laws. You see, in practice, this sort of law isn't particularly enforceable, short of, say, positioning a guard outside every public restroom to check your birth certificate, inspect your genitals, and perform a karyotype test to determine your chromosomal makeup. And at that point, you have to wait like a week for the results, and it's a huge hassle. Bottom line, these laws can't really be enforced as written. What they can do, and indeed what they have done, is create a culture in which those who stray from stereotypical gender appearances face harassment. In light of these laws gaining national attention, there's been a major uptick of cis women facing harassment in restrooms for looking like men. At Fishbone's restaurant in Detroit, a security guard saw a short-haired woman who he thought was a man enter the bathroom. He then barged in, dragged her out of the restroom, ignored her attempts to show him her ID, and tossed her into the street, injuring and embarrassing her. In a Connecticut Walmart, a woman wearing a baseball cap was harassed by another woman while washing her hands, being treated to cries of, "You're disgusting," and "You don't belong here." And at a medical center in Texas, a cisgender man followed a cisgender woman into the women's restroom because he thought she was trans. These laws aren't preventing cis women from getting assaulted in restrooms, they're preventing all women from being able to have short hair or wear pants without being harassed. Additionally, there's the issue of trans athletes in sports. Now, this is a topic that has seemingly gripped conservative politicians more than anything else as of late. 10 states have passed legislation so far this year banning trans students from playing school sports, And in some cases, these bans are just straight up petty. Take Kentucky. Now, Kentucky is, to put it politely, a state whose education system is pretty bad. But rather than do anything about it, the Kentucky legislature is instead spending their time pushing through a trans athlete ban to ban literally one girl from playing field hockey for her middle school team. A team which, by the way, only exists because she started it. Because the school did not previously have a girls' field hockey team. This is also the case in Ohio, where Republicans are currently pushing a bill that would also only ban one trans girl, a softball player who, by her own admission, isn't particularly good at softball. These laws treat trans people, particularly trans girls, like they're dominant forces with unfair biological advantages that must be ostracized to maintain the integrity of school sports. But this just isn't true. Trans athletes aren't dominating on any level of competition from school to the pros. Conservatives love to point out scattered instances of trans women winning competitions, but they're fine ignoring the vast majority of competitions where they don't win. And when you just cherry pick an athlete's best performances, anyone looks dominant. If I applied this same approach, I could conclude that Stan Wawrinka is the greatest tennis player of all time, because he won the 2014 Australian Open, the 2015 French Open, and the 2016 US Open. Clearly, Stanimal here has an unfair advantage, and we must ban him from the sport. These laws also ignore the whole point of student athletics. For the vast majority of students, the goal isn't and shouldn't be going pro, but rather building friendships and promoting an active lifestyle. When you kick trans kids out of school sports, you're stealing what can be for some a crucial support structure. Many trans kids lean on school as a source of gender affirmation, and the rates of suicide reflect this, as they're lower when students view school as a gender-affirming environment. But by kicking trans kids off the sports teams, you deny them the opportunity to play the games they love, the camaraderie and acceptance that comes with being part of a team, and directly deny that they truly are the gender they claim to be. It's no understatement to claim that these laws will contribute to the deaths of trans kids, but they also make the experience worse for cis kids. A while back, I rewatched 42, the movie about Jackie Robinson. Late in the film, there's this scene where a young boy and his father are in Cincinnati watching a game. Robinson enters the field to a chorus of abuse. They're all calling him the N-word, telling him to go home, the works. And the young boy sits there for a minute before joining in with his own newly learned racism. Now, while I've gone in depth in previous videos on the continuing issue of racism in this country, there's been a lot of progress made in terms of interpersonal racism. On the whole, white kids are much more likely to see black kids as equals rather than targets for racial abuse. And one of the greatest reasons for this is integration. Later in the film, the Dodgers manager tells Jackie Robinson about how he saw a little white boy who wanted to be just like him. This anecdote is a testament to how when it comes to overcoming societally taught bigotry, representation matters. And just as important as seeing minorities represented in the upper levels of sport is having them participating on every level below that. Having trans students able to play with cis students is critical to combating prejudice in much the same way having black students able to play with white students is. I worry that we currently have millions of kids around the country who are just like that boy, with their parents imparting transphobic beliefs upon them. And because of these laws, countless kids will never have to confront their own beliefs. Forcing children to remain ignorant about the wider world and the variety of people inhabiting it is a bad thing. Now, I've just made what I believe to be a pretty compelling case for how kicking trans students out of school sports harms cisgender kids by fostering bigotry. I think allowing kids to remain prejudiced is pretty bad. But if that wasn't enough to convince you that these laws hurt cis people too, they can also force students to undergo genital exams. In early June, the Ohio State House passed a bill that would seek to ban trans athletes in school sports. What made Ohio's bill particularly notable was that anyone could challenge a student's sex, and the onus would then be on that student to prove their sex by getting a physician's letter based on their genitals, their testosterone level, or their genetics. Now, due to backlash, and to help the bill get passed into law, Ohio State legislators are saying they've removed the genital exam bit, and now claim the bill will only focus on genetic makeup. But let's not convince ourselves that this is good news. Firstly, they're dropping the genital exams in this instance because they don't believe it would pass. But it's clear that once the political climate is right, they're going to go all in. How do we know this? Because they already did it in Idaho, where a law that does the exact same thing, genital exams and all, has been on the books for 2 years now. Secondly, mandatory DNA testing is still a bad thing. For starters, who's paying for this test? DNA testing isn't exactly cheap, and the bill just says that the athlete must provide a physician's note. So I imagine the student or their family has to shell out for a DNA test because some random asshole said, "Prove you're a girl." And you don't really get more invasive medical procedure than literally looking at someone's DNA. Additionally, it bears mention that there are cisgender girls who have a Y chromosome, such as those with Swyer syndrome. Whenever genetic abnormalities get brought up, transphobes tend to say, that's a vast minority of the population. But just because there's only a couple people who would be affected, doesn't make a bill that would kick these cis girls off their teams acceptable. And also, you know who else is a vast minority of the population? Fucking trans people. But that doesn't stop y'all from bitching about them 24/7. Thirdly, it's just kind of insulting to see a female athlete performing well and immediately say, you must secretly be a man. The people pushing these laws talk so much about protecting the children. But what lesson does it send to young girls when all their accomplishments are viewed through a lens that sees boys as unilaterally genetically superior? And this attitude carries all the way up to the pros, where female athletes, especially black female athletes, regularly have their accomplishments disparaged by accusations that they're secretly men. Take, for example, the greatest female athlete of all time, and my second excuse to talk about tennis in this video, Serena Williams. From the late 90s through the mid-2010s, Serena had one of the most dominant runs in WTA history. But marring her excellence the entire time were accusations that she was secretly a man. These accusations stem from her large muscles and strength, as well as just racism. It seems like if you're a cisgender female athlete that doesn't fit perfectly into a certain person's narrow view of what constitutes a woman, you're bound to experience transphobia. Because a lot of people simply can't comprehend a professional athlete having big muscles. Besides the direct discrimination female pros face due to transphobia, the focus on banning trans athletes also does indirect harm by taking attention away from the more pressing issues facing women's sports, namely, a lack of coverage and pay comparable to their male counterparts. Women make less on average than men in every single major sport, to the extent that for many women, being a professional athlete isn't enough to cover their bills, meaning less time for training and a worse product on the field. Women's sports need more coverage so that there's enough money flowing into the leagues to pay them. Opponents of increasing female athletes' salaries will point out that, for example, leagues like the WNBA don't really make money, as the reason for why female athletes get paid less. But to make money, a league needs to invest money into the players to ensure the highest quality product on the court, and promote and cover the league to drive eyeballs to the games. We know that women's sports can be popular and profitable. US women's soccer, for example, has been generating similar or greater revenue than US men's soccer for years now. But even in sports where the viewership and the pay between men and women are roughly the same, such as tennis, women still lag behind in terms of coverage in the media. Lack of adequate news coverage is a significant factor in why women's sports lack the same pay and opportunity as men's. When there's little to no coverage in the news, people have a harder time following the league, and the league has less fans. With women's sports as a whole only accounting for 4% of sports media coverage, it's no wonder the pay gap is so insane. Addressing these issues is infinitely more important for women's sports on the whole than kicking a couple trans women out of the league. Yet these supposedly feminist transphobes keep society focused on making life worse for a few trans athletes, doing less than nothing for women's sports as a whole, as female athletes struggle for equal representation and pay. And we could go on and on and on about how parents of trans kids in Texas risk having their children taken away by Child Protective Services, or how restrictions on comprehensive sex ed, so kids don't learn about trans people, results in more children being sexually abused and becoming pregnant, or how attacks on trans people inevitably lead to attacks on lesbian, gay, and bisexual people. Once discrimination against one minority group becomes socially acceptable again, another is made a target. But if you haven't accepted that transphobia is also harmful to cisgender people at this point, odds are your mind was never open to the idea in the first place. Because as much as I'd like for transphobes to watch this video, realize they're hurting themselves too, and knock it off, I recognize that's probably not going to happen. This video isn't for the people who are pushing these laws. It's for the people who are sitting on the sidelines watching it happen. It is not enough to merely be a passive observer. You have a stake in this. Whether you're a member of another minority group who will be next up on the chopping block once they're through with trans people, or a cis person who doesn't want to face endless harassment for not fitting into narrow views of what proper gender expression is, or just somebody who thinks the needless suffering of millions of people is probably a bad thing. This is your fight too. Because an attack on the most vulnerable members of our society is an attack on every member of our society. Thanks for watching. Before I get to the YouTuber end credit stuff, I'd like to direct y'all towards some organizations doing important work in this area. First up is Athlete Ally, an organization focused on combating homophobia and transphobia in sports. Then there's the Trevor Project. You may be familiar with their LGBTQ crisis hotline, which is great, but they also do significant advocacy work beyond that. And finally, the ACLU, who have some of the best educational resources on trans rights, which I used extensively in this video, in addition to all the other work they do. They also cover a lot of other rights, so say, hypothetically, just for example, that, abortion rights were in jeopardy, they'd also be a good place to go. Links to all of those will be in the description or a pinned comment if you want to donate or get involved. With that all being said, like, comment, and subscribe, and a special thank you to my lovely patrons, including the $10 and up patrons, Sleepy Boy Uwu. They fund this channel's extensive headband budget, and the link to that will be in the description too. Once again, happy Pride Month, even though I didn't finish this video until it's almost over.